Hey guys, Mr. O'Brien here, and in this video what we're going to be talking about is how matter recycles itself through an ecosystem. So in other words, we use our resources. How do they get replaced back into our atmosphere or our soil? So this is part 5 of your topic 8 chapter of ecology. Now, in this, we're going to be talking about a couple different things specifically. We're going to be talking about water and the water cycle, probably one you're pretty familiar with. We're going to be talking about carbon dioxide. We're going to be talking about oxygen. And we're going to be talking about nitrogen. So we're going to talk about these different cycles, how they move through our ecosystems. Now, the water cycle is probably the one that you're most familiar with. The water cycle is the movement of water through oceans, atmospheres, lands, and living things. Now, every living thing needs water. Water is one of the most important molecules that we have that actually supports life. So the water cycle is powered by a very strong force. It's a force called the sun. So the sun provides the energy to evaporate the water, move the water through ecosystems, and actually keep this process going to replenish it over millions upon millions of years. So let's go through the general steps of the water cycle. So the first one we have is evaporation. So water is stored in these big oceans. Okay, most of the evaporation occurs in these oceans, but it can actually occur in ponds, lakes, streams, rivers. So evaporation is the process of going from a liquid to a gas, and that gas enters in the atmosphere. Now, there's another way that gas gets in the atmosphere. It's a process called transpiration. Now, transpiration is when plants absorb water through their roots and release it into the atmosphere as gas as well. So how this works is the water goes up into the leaves where photosynthesis occurs, and there's these little pores in the leaves called stomata. These stomata open and close to release gases and things like that. So both evaporation and transpiration are releasing water vapor into our atmosphere. So once it gets released in the atmosphere, eventually it's going to cool down. And when it cools down, it's going to condense in the form of clouds. So condensation is the process of going from gas to a cloud that is able to then release precipitation. So what happens is when the cloud gets too much water and is too cold, what's eventually going to happen is that water is going to get too heavy and fall to the ground in the form of precipitation. Then what happens is one of two things. It can either run off, where the water just runs over the surface of the land into some other body of water, and again, on its way it's collecting pollutants, or it can get absorbed in the ground through a process of infiltration. So again, this is what the water is then going to do. It's either going to run over the land to a bigger body of water, or it's going to get soaked up into the ground level. So let's talk about each one of these steps a little bit more in detail. So evaporation is just simply water changes from liquid to a vapor. And again, like I said earlier, the energy from the sun causes water vapor to evaporate. Most evaporation is from oceans or other sort of big body of water. So here's the evaporation process right here. We go from a liquid to a gas that is now up into the atmosphere. So transpiration is another process that gets water into the atmosphere, and this is from plants. So what happens is water comes in through the roots, it goes through the system, and then eventually it is released into the atmosphere through a process called transpiration. So evaporation and transpiration both are releasing water vapor. But in transpiration, plants release water vapor through their leaves, again through a pore called the stomata. Condensation is when all of that gas gets cooled down and forms in the clouds. So as air rises higher into the atmosphere, it cools. And as it cools, cool air can't hold as much water as warm air. And what we get is these beautiful structures that look like different things called clouds. Now, clouds can actually be millions of tons in weight. But you're saying, how could something that big float up in the sky. Well, think about it. Every time it rains, how much weight in water actually falls? So when water condenses, it forms as clouds till eventually it gets so heavy that it's actually unable to support that weight, and that is when we get precipitation. So these clouds are moving, they're moving, eventually they get so heavy that the water droplets in the clouds fall to the earth, and that is when we get rain or some sort of other precipitation like freezing rain, sleet, or snow. So precipitation is water that falls from clouds to the earth. Again, without precipitation, a lot of people in the world would be in trouble with major droughts. Again, water is needed for life. Now, once that water hits the ground, it flows over the surface of the land in a process called runoff. Now, the thing about runoff is as it's moving over land, it picks up things like fertilizer as well as other pollutants. This is actually one of the biggest distributor of pollutants in the world. So the water, when it's moving very fast, picks up these pollutants and distributes them into large bodies of water like our oceans or even like our lakes and ponds. Now, infiltration is when that water actually seeps into the ground. So it is actually increasing our water table. Infiltration is the process by which water soaks into the ground. So some of the water may seep deep underground and some may stay in the soil where plants can absorb it into the roots. So again, we need this infiltration to occur to keep our plants alive. Now let's move on to the next cycle that we have, and that's the carbon cycle. Now the carbon cycle is pretty much how carbon dioxide enters and leaves our atmosphere. Now there are two major processes that put carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. The first one we have is respiration. So respiration is the process of animals breathing, and they release CO2 as they are breathing. The other one is probably one that you do in your house all the time. Well, I'm assuming you're breathing in your house as well, but that's a process called combustion. Now, combustion is another thing that increases the amount of CO2, and this is just when we are burning fossil fuels or even wood itself. Combustion is when we take that carbon-based fossil fuel, burn it, and the carbon is then released in the form of fossil fuels or in the form of carbon dioxide. The same thing happens when you're driving a car or anything like that. So again, remember, these are two things that are increasing CO2 in our atmosphere: animals breathing as well as combustion. Now, carbon dioxide is absorbed or taken out of the atmosphere by producers. Remember, producers are plants. And they take them out of the atmosphere to make carbohydrates. They make glucose in a process called photosynthesis. So now this carbon dioxide is getting absorbed by the plants, and they're decreasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So these producers are things like plants, algae, other things. And what they actually give off is oxygen, which also drives the process of respiration, which is absorbed by our animals. But again, photosynthesis decreases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, animals feed on these plants, and thus the plants are now passing on their carbon compounds along the food chain to other organisms. So most of the carbon these animals consume is actually exhaled as carbon dioxide, which again is increasing our CO2. This is through the process of respiration. The animals and plants will eventually die. And when those animals die, they have a lot of carbon in their body. So when they die, they release that into the atmosphere and are broken down by organisms called decomposers. So the dead organisms, the cow, the bird, are eaten by these decomposers like bacteria and fungi. And decomposition releases that carbon back into the atmosphere to be used up by other things like plants and animals. So decomposition is how the carbon from animals get back into the atmosphere. So the carbon that was in their bodies is then returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. In some circumstances, the process of decomposition is prevented, which would be how our fossil fuels are formed. So again, again, fossil fuel production doesn't happen like that. It's a very slow process of millions of years, and it needs the absolute right conditions. So, for example, to form stuff like coal was actually formed by plants that died in swamps. Oil is actually the remnants of marine animals. Now, both of these fossil fuels, they restricted the decomposition of these animals, which is why fossil fuels were produced. Again, that could be burned in the future to release more carbon dioxide. Now, the oxygen cycle is kind of similar to the carbon dioxide cycle, and the fact of how oxygen is replaced and replenished kind of goes through the same processes. So, stage one of putting oxygen in the atmosphere is a process called photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is releasing oxygen, O2, into the atmosphere. Again, the oxygen is the byproduct of this overall process of photosynthesis, where we are producing glucose. Now, animals use that oxygen to breathe, and that oxygen then enters into the animals and is released as carbon dioxide in a process called respiration. Now, when animals exhale that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, it then can be used again by the plants, and this whole process keeps going. So the oxygen cycle is just simply photosynthesis to produce oxygen, carbon dioxide to use the oxygen and produce CO2, which then could be used by photosynthesis. Now, the nitrogen cycle is a little bit more tricky. And the reason that we need the nitrogen cycle is organisms organisms will require nitrogen to produce amino acids. Now remember, amino acids are our bases of proteins. Without proteins, our body cannot function. So nitrogen makes up about 78% of the atmosphere, but we cannot use nitrogen directly from the atmosphere, which is why we need these organisms to break it down and make it a usable form for animals. So nitrogen fixators are these bacteria that are in some plants, but not all plants, like soybeans. Now, nitrogen fixation is the step which is characterized by the conversion of atmospheric N2 gas into ammonia gas. Now, ammonia is now able to be used by plants, so it's a very important process to starting this whole thing. Now, the other way that nitrogen fixation can occur is actually by lightning. You ever smell that smell? I don't know how to, it's like the earthy smell after a lightning storm, or what that is the lightning actually converting nitrogen gas into ammonia. You're smelling that ammonia. Now, assimilation is the process once the nitrogen has been fixed in the soil, plants can absorb that through their roots. So once ammonia is produced, plants can now use it, and now it becomes available to organisms, because now the organisms can eat the plants and get that nitrogen from them. Now, nitrification is when bacteria convert that nitrogen in the soil into nitrites and nitrates. Again, these nitrites and nitrates are used as fertilizer so that plants can grow and absorb that nitrogen. So denitrification is when that nitrites and nitrates are then converted back into atmospheric nitrogen, usually by bacteria. So again, the only way that animals can get their nitrogen is by eating plants that have done assimilation. Again, using that by the plants and absorbing nitrogen through their roots. Now, if we look at the nitrogen cycle, again, we have our large amounts of nitrogen gas in our atmosphere. But again, we can't use that. So we have these bacteria that fix that nitrogen into a usable form. A usable form like ammonia, which the plants can absorb into their roots. Now, once nitrogen fixation occurs, nitrification occurs by different bacteria to produce nitrites and nitrates. A process called nitrification that is then absorbed through a process called assimilation, where it is then absorbed by the plants. Then eventually another bacteria, denitrification, will replace it back into our atmosphere. Now, decomposers actually can break down nitrogen as well into ammonia, that really pungent smell you smell of like a decomposing body. So again, the nitrogen cycle is mostly done by bacteria that make that nitrogen available to the plants so that not only the plants, but we can use it as well. So hopefully this helps you out with how matter is recycled through an ecosystem. Again, this is part 5 of topic 8, ecology chapter. Hopefully hopefully this video helps you out. Again, this is Mr. O'Brien signing off.